I had learned to keep my breathing steady whenever the council's emissaries entered the chamber. Their presence was designed to unsettle, every gesture calculated to remind us that humanity was tolerated, not respected. But I had long since trained myself to see through the theater. Their arrogance was a mask, and masks could be manipulated. The latest session was supposed to be routine trade quotas, resource allocations, the endless bureaucratic grind that the council used to keep Earth compliant. Yet buried in the agenda was a clause so subtle most humans would have missed it. A redefinition of cultural sovereignty, tucked between agricultural tariffs and atmospheric monitoring. To them, it was a minor adjustment. To me, it was the opening we had been waiting for. I leaned forward, feigning confusion, and asked for clarification. My tone was deliberately naive, the kind that made the aliens underestimate me. They explained with their usual condescension that the clause allowed the council to harmonize cultural practices across member species. Harmonize, a word that meant erasure. If past Earth's traditions, laws, even languages could be standardized into oblivion. I thanked them politely, then requested a recess. Behind closed doors, I spread the documents across the table for my fellow operatives. We weren't soldiers. Our weapons were words, precedent, and the council's own obsession with procedure. If they want harmonization, I whispered, then we'll drown them in it. We drafted a countermotion citing obscure council statutes, some dating back centuries, that required unanimous consent for cultural integration. We cross-referenced alien treaties, highlighted contradictions, and buried them in a labyrinth of legal jargon so dense it would take weeks to unravel. Every line was a trap, every footnote a snare. When the session resumed, I presented our motion with the calm authority of someone who knew the council's bureaucracy better than they did. The emissaries sneered, but they couldn't dismiss it outright. To do so would violate their own laws, and the council's greatest weakness was its devotion to the illusion of fairness. As the debate dragged on, I watched their composure crack. They had expected compliance, not resistance. They had expected fear, not cunning. And in that moment I realized the truth. Survival wasn't about strength. It was about forcing them to play our game on our terms until they tripped over their own rules. I sat back, hands folded, and let the silence stretch. The council chamber was heavy with tension, the kind that made even the most arrogant alien hesitate. For the first time, I felt the balance shift. Not in our favor yet, but enough to remind them that humanity was not a species to be harmonized away. We were shadows in their bureaucracy, and shadows had teeth. We need to continue the story from the first-person perspective. The previous part ended with the protagonist feeling the balance shift, using legal tactics. The next part should advance the plot, perhaps a setback or a countermove by the aliens or deeper infiltration. Keep it engaging, no headings, no markdown. Maintain the tone of bureaucratic warfare, intelligence, psychological manipulation. The protagonist is a deep-cover operative. Let's write a seamless continuation. The recess ended and the chamber reconvened. I felt the weight of their stares, calculating, predatory. The Silthari ambassador, a being of shifting iridescence, rose first. Her voice was silk over steel. The human motion is noted. However, the Council's charter allows for provisional measures when a species' cultural practices pose a risk to galactic stability. She paused, letting the implication hang. We have evidence that Earth's media contains subversive narratives. Harmless perhaps, but cumulatively dangerous. Therefore, we invoke Article 17b. My stomach dropped. Article 17b was a loophole we had never anticipated, a clause that let the Council bypass unanimous consent if they deemed a culture unstable. It had been used only once before against a species that had since been assimilated into silence. I kept my face blank, but my mind raced. They had prepared for this. They had a counter to our counter, but I had prepared too. I had spent years studying their legal archives, memorizing every precedent, every obscure footnote. I stood slowly, deliberately, and pulled a datapad from my jacket. Article 17b requires a 3-vote majority confirmation from the Council's Ethics Subcommittee, I said, my voice steady. That subcommittee has not convened in 63 cycles. According to Procedural Code 421, any dormant committee must be reactivated before its rulings can be applied. The reactivation process takes a minimum of 4 standard weeks. I had their attention now. The Silthari ambassador's colors flickered, annoyance perhaps. And what of the interim, she asked. The interim, I replied, is governed by the prior status quo. Earth's cultural sovereignty remains intact until the subcommittee meets. Unless you wish to violate your own procedural code, which would set a precedent for any species to challenge your rulings. I let the words sink in. I'm sure the Council values its consistency. The chamber fell into a murmur. I had bought us time, 4 weeks, but I knew they would use every second to find another crack in the armor. I met my team's eyes across the room. We had stopped the first blow, but the war was just beginning, and in the shadows of their own bureaucracy we would need to be faster, sharper, and more ruthless than they ever expected. We need to continue the story from where it left off. The protagonist has just bought 4 weeks by invoking procedural code. The narrative should flow naturally, first person, maintaining the tone of bureaucratic warfare, intelligence, psychological manipulation. No headings, no markdown. Continue seamlessly from we had stopped the first blow, but the war was just beginning. And in the shadows of their own bureaucracy, we would need to be faster, sharper, and more ruthless than they ever expected. The next part should show the protagonist's next move, perhaps a private conversation with their team or a deeper layer of the plan. Keep it engaging, showing intelligence and espionage. Avoid space battles. Use first person. The chamber dissolved into controlled chaos. I kept my breathing steady as I gathered my datapad and stepped back from the podium, my heels clicking against the polished obsidian floor. A Silthari aide brushed past me, her scent sharp with ozone, a warning or just the natural discharge of her species. I didn't flinch. In the corridor outside, I found Lena, my second, leaning against a wall that hummed with alien circuitry. Her face was pale, but her eyes were sharp. 4 weeks, she whispered. That's not enough. It's enough to dig, I said, leading her toward a maintenance alcove where I knew the council's surveillance was spotty. I had mapped every blind spot in this building over 7 years of service. They'll try to fast-track the subcommittee. We need to stall further. There's a motion to delay any reactivation vote until a quorum of all member species is present. That quorum has never been achieved in less than 6 weeks. She nodded, already pulling up the relevant statutes on her wristcom. I can draft it, but we need a sponsor from outside our block, someone neutral. I thought of Ambassador Trell of the Xylos, a crustacean-like being who owed me a favor from an arbitration I had tilted in his favor 2 years ago. He was cautious, but he despised the Silthari. I'll handle Trell tonight, you work on the wording, no loopholes. And find out who on the ethics subcommittee is most susceptible to pressure or blackmail. Lena gave a grim smile and slipped away. I turned back toward my quarters, my mind already cataloging the next dozen moves. They had the weight of galactic power. We had the desperation of a species with nothing left to lose. That made us more dangerous than they could imagine. The hum of the corridor's ambient energy grid thrummed under my boots as I cut through a less trafficked service wing, my pace casual enough to avoid drawing notice from the occasional passing Silthari functionary or robotic sentry. My quarters were 3 levels down, a cramped cell the council had assigned me as a junior administrative liaison for the Human Liaison Office, a title that carried less weight than the janitorial droid that emptied my waste bin twice a day. I keyed the entry code, waited the 2 mandatory seconds for the biometric scan to confirm my identity, and slipped inside before the door fully hissed shut. First thing first, I pulled the compact counter-surveillance wand from my inner jacket pocket and swept the room in slow, methodical passes. The small red light on the wand flickered once, hovering over the air vent above my desk. I didn't reach for it. Removing it would only alert the Silthari internal security team that I'd found it, and I needed them to think I was exactly the harried, overmatched human bureaucrat they'd pegged me as for 7 years. Instead, I adjusted the wand's output to broadcast a low-level interference signal that would scramble any audio the sensor picked up for the next 72 hours, then tucked the wand back into my pocket. Let them listen to me pace and mutter about impossible deadlines and failed motions. Let them think I was already halfway to breaking. I sat at the desk, tapping the sequence to unlock the encrypted partition on my datapad that held the 7 years of compiled evidence I'd gathered. Every unlogged Silthari incursion into neutral species territory, every backroom deal that bypassed the Galactic Accord's Oversight Committee, every quiet threat they'd made to smaller delegations who'd voiced support for limited human autonomy. It was a thick file, enough to trigger a full council inquiry if the right people saw it, but too easy for the Silthari to bury if I released it publicly. I needed to feed it to the right people, one piece at a time, make them think they'd found it themselves. The council's public cultural broadcast was playing on the wall screen, a grainy recording of a 20th-century Earth jazz quartet, the kind of music the Silthari tolerated as harmless primitive noise and never bothered to monitor closely. I tapped a sequence into my datapad, embedding the encoded request for Trell into a split-second glitch in the saxophone riff, a subharmonic frequency only Xylo's auditory receptors could pick up, buried so deep in the broadcast's audio feed no other species' sensor would flag it. It would take him 10 minutes to decode it, less if he was already waiting for my signal. I pulled up the encrypted channel to the rest of my cell then, the 4 of us spread across the council's administrative ranks, no 2 of us ever seen together in public. Javi's face popped up first, his features sharp, the faint scar across his left cheekbone a reminder of the Silthari raid on his hometown before we'd managed to get him embedded in their logistics core. Good news, he said, keeping his voice low. The compliance drones they're stockpiling in Hangar 7. They're listed as unregistered waste disposal units on the inventory logs. No military classification, no declared payload. I've already copied the manifests. If we file a motion to audit all unregistered heavy equipment in Council sovereign space, that hangar gets flagged first. They can't move the drones without triggering a full audit, and if they try to hide the inventory, that's a Class 1 Accords violation. That buys us at least 3 months of stall time minimum. I nodded, already drafting the motion in a separate window on my datapad. Good. Attach the manifest as an anonymous addendum to the audit request, file it through the Centauri delegations portal. They hate the Silthari's waste dumping in their outer system. They'll push it through before the week is out. Next came Mara, her face framed by the formal Centauri aide's headdress she wore to work, her expression tight with barely contained excitement. I've got the 3 swing votes on the ethics subcommittee, she said, sliding a file across the virtual table between us. All 3 have been quietly furious about the Silthari's seizure of Kael'th's protected agrarian zones last quarter. They thought it was swept under the rug, but I've got the full survey data, the displaced species testimonies, the Accord's violation codes. They're ready to vote to table any human-related legislation until the Kael'th incident is fully investigated. That's your quorum delay right there. You don't even need Trell's sponsorship if you frame the motion as a prerequisite for any species-related vote, not just human ones. My RISCOM buzzed then, a single unencrypted ping from the public broadcast channel, the Xylos confirmation glyph I'd agreed on with Trell, a 6-legged crustacean silhouette, claws raised in a neutral gesture. I showed it to the others on the call, and Javi let out a quiet huff of laughter. Trell's on board, I said, leaning back in my chair, the weight of the last 7 years suddenly feeling a little lighter. We've got the audit motion, the Kael'th investigation trigger, and the quorum delay all lined up. The Silthari wanted to push a vote to cull 80% of the human population and designate the rest as a protected labor caste within 3 weeks. We just turned that into a 6-month administrative logjam minimum, with a full council inquiry into their own misconduct hanging over their heads the entire time. Mara smiled, sharp and cold. Bureaucracy is the most brutal weapon we have, isn't it? They spent centuries building a system that lets them steamroll smaller species, and we just learned to use the gears against them. Exactly, I said, tapping the final draft of the quorum delay motion, already scheduled to be accidentally leaked to the mid-level administrative staff of every non-Silthari delegation by the end of the night. They think we're going to fight them with protests, with riots, with whatever scraps of military tech we've managed to hide since the invasion. They never stopped to think we'd learn their language, their precious, boring, infuriating language of forms and committees and procedural code. We're not fighting a war. We're filing the paperwork that ends theirs. I ended the call, then leaned back, staring at the jazz quartet still playing on the wall screen, the saxophone wailing a little louder now as if it knew. Outside the door I heard the faint click of a Silthari security sensor passing by, checking the door's lock status. I smiled just a little. Let them check. Let them think I was in here drafting a failing motion, panicking, ready to fold. They had no idea that the motion I was actually drafting would tie their entire agenda in knots for half a year. Give us time to dig up more dirt, to turn more delegations, to build the case that would make the council itself turn on the Silthari leadership. We didn't need ships, we didn't need bombs, we just needed to be better at the game they'd spent millennia writing the rules for. And we'd had a lot of time to practice. The soft double chime of my encrypted subchannel cut through the saxophone's wail half a second later, Mara's ID flashing across the bottom of the wall screen before I tapped it open. 2 Silthari compliance officers posted at your corridor junction, her text scrolled, no wasted words. They're waving that copy of your appeasement draft you accidentally left on the shared admin terminal last week. Asking why you're stalling on the cull vote, saying they're running out of patience with human foot dragging. I didn't bother hiding my smirk as I typed back the pre-scripted jittery response I'd rehearsed a dozen times for exactly this scenario. Fuck off, I'm rewriting it to include their stupid luxury resource tax clauses they demanded last quarter. Tell them they can wait or do the paperwork themselves. I hit send, then set the message to self-destruct in 30 seconds, the countdown ticking down in the corner of my comm display. The Silthari sensor outside my door stuttered for half a second, then, the faint hum of its scan picking up the dissonant syncopation of the jazz quartet pouring from my wall speakers. I'd picked that playlist deliberately, after 6 months of observation confirmed Silthari auditory processing glitches on irregular, non-harmonic human music. They wrote my office off as a waste of monitoring resources within a month of my arrival, too annoyed by the noise to bother parsing what I was actually doing in here. I pulled up the file I'd been working on for the last 3 hours, buried under 17 layers of encrypted subfolders mislabeled as a quarterly supply requisition for the human residential zone's waste management system. The decoy motion I'd left on the shared terminal was exactly what the Silthari expected. A half-baked proposal to delay the cull by 6 weeks, full of loopholes they could exploit to ram it through anyway, designed to make them think I was panicking, willing to fold if they applied enough pressure. This file, the one glowing faintly on my private unlinked display, was the real one. The first clause triggered the quorum delay exactly as we'd planned, but the second, buried 3 paragraphs down under a fake line about human labor productivity incentives, activated the Kael'th Oversight Review. I'd spent 18 months slipping Trell verified proof of Silthari infractions, falsified human population counts to inflate the resource surplus they claimed justified the cull illegal unregulated mining on the human lunar colonies that violated 12 separate council environmental statutes, bribes paid to 3 mid-tier Xylos and Vera delegates to block any procedural challenges to their agenda. Trell had cross-referenced each piece of evidence against Xylo's internal trade logs and Kael'th audit records, confirmed every trace would hold up under even the most ruthless procedural scrutiny. I added a fake comment trail to the file, timestamps showing me arguing with Javi and Mara 2 days prior about removing the Kael'th trigger, making it look like I'd only slipped it in as an afterthought last night, too tired to notice the risk. The Silthari would dig through it if they got their hands on it, see the fake arguments, write it off as a sloppy mistake by a panicking human delegate who didn't know the rules well enough to avoid shooting himself in the foot. They'd never think to look for the 3 co-sponsor signatures already attached to the motion's hidden metadata. The Vera trade rep whose trade routes the Silthari had tried to seize last year, the Kael'th junior auditor whose promotion the Silthari had blocked for exposing their falsified census data, the Molluscari environmental delegate whose home moon the Silthari had tried to designate as a mining dump 6 months prior. All of them had agreed to sign publicly the second the motion hit the floor, making it impossible for the Silthari to table it without triggering a full review of their leadership's conduct. I set the file to autoleak to the inbox of every non-Silthari delegation's mid-level admin staff at 200 station time to hit the night shift crews half asleep, too slow to flag it to their Silthari-aligned superiors before the morning session opened. The decoy motion would be the one everyone found first, the one the Silthari would gloat over, the one they'd spend the first hour of the session tearing apart to prove how desperate and stupid we were. They'd never see the real motion coming. Outside my door, the Silthari sensor finished its pass, clicking softly as it moved down the corridor. I leaned back in my chair, tapping the jazz quartet's volume up just a little, and pulled up the draft of the next motion I'd be filing in 3 months, the one that would roll back every single Silthari resource seizure since the invasion began, one procedural clause at a time. They'd spent millennia building a system to crush species they considered lesser, never stopping to think those species would learn to read the fine print better than they ever did. Let them check my door, let them think I was panicking. By the time they realized what was happening, we'd already won. The soft chime of the council chamber's opening bell echoed through the vaulted hall, a sound that had once signified the bland rhythm of interspecies diplomacy, now charged with a quiet electricity. I slipped my badge into the slot beside the dais, the familiar weight of polymer and alloy grounding me as I took my seat among the human delegation. Across the aisle, the Silthari delegation sat in their usual formation, tall, carapace-clad figures whose mandibles clicked in a language of subsonic vibrations that most of us had learned to feel rather than hear. Their lead envoy Vraxel tilted his head slightly, the faintest ripple of irritation passing through his posture as the night shift admins began to filter in, rubbing sleep from their eyes. The holographic display above the central podium flickered to life, projecting the agenda for the morning session. At the top in bold, unmistakable glyphs was the decoy motion I had planted. Proposal to restrict Silthari access to Level 7 trade routes, submitted by human delegate Elias Rook. The file's metadata showed my fabricated argument trail, the timestamps, the weary sighs of Javi and Mara. I could almost hear the Silthari's internal processors parsing the data, flagging it as a low-priority clerical error, a human misstep born of fatigue. A murmur rippled through the chamber as the Silthari-aligned aides began to whisper, their translators converting the subsonic clicks into the crisp, monotone voice of the council's language suite. Vraxel stood, his carapace catching the ambient light, and addressed the hall with a voice that resonated like a distant drum. Esteemed council, we have before us a frivolous submission, clearly the product of human oversight. Let us examine its merits and dismiss it swiftly, lest we waste the council's valuable time on baseless accusations. He gestured, and the hologram zoomed in on the motion's text, highlighting the clauses that would have supposedly curtailed Silthari trade privileges. The Silthari aides leaned forward, their mandibles clicking in anticipation of tearing the proposal apart. I felt a quiet pulse of satisfaction. The decoy was doing exactly what I intended, absorbing their attention, their ire, their computational resources. As Vraxel launched into his rebuttal, citing trade agreements and historical precedents, I slipped my hand beneath the table and activated the concealed comms link embedded in my cufflink. A soft, encrypted pulse traveled through the chamber's shielding, reaching the secure node I had planted in the archives 3 weeks prior. There, buried under layers of benign diplomatic correspondence, lay the real motion, crafted not as a blunt objection but as a meticulous amendment to the very procedural code the Silthari used to justify their resource seizures. The real motion was a masterstroke of bureaucratic subterfuge, a series of seemingly innocuous revisions to the Resource Allocation and Audit Transparency Act, each clause designed to retroactively invalidate the legal basis for every Silthari seizure since the invasion. By altering definitions of authorized survey and tightening audit thresholds, the motion would force the Silthari to return seized assets or face a cascade of legal challenges that could cripple their standing within the council hierarchy. Because it was framed as a housekeeping update, nothing more than a routine housekeeping measure, it would slip past their threat detection algorithms, which were tuned to spot overt challenges, not subtle rewrites of their own legal scaffolding. I watched as Vraxel's voice rose, his confidence swelling with each point he believed he was scoring. The human delegates exchanged glances, our faces a mask of polite interest. When he finally concluded, the Silthari aide to his left initiated the voting sequence. The holographic tally bar crawled upward, the Silthari block's votes flashing in a steady, predictable green. I felt the familiar tension in my chest, not from fear but from the certainty that the real motion was already in motion, quietly propagating through the council's internal networks. The vote concluded with a decisive majority against the decoy motion. Vraxel inclined his head, a thin smile playing at the corners of his mandibles. The council has spoken, let us proceed to the next item. As the session moved on, I felt a subtle shift in the air, a faint, almost imperceptible tightening of the Silthari delegation's posture. Their aides exchanged quick glances, their translators stuttering as they received silent alerts from their internal compliance monitors. The real motion, having been auto-distributed to the mid-level admin inboxes at 200, had begun to percolate upward. Junior clerks, still half asleep, had opened the file, skimmed the seemingly innocuous amendments and, unaware of its true potency, forwarded it to their superiors for routine review. Those superiors, trusting the procedural hygiene of the council, passed it along to the legal compliance team, who, in turn, flagged it for a standard audit. Exactly the process the Silthari had rigged to catch blatant violations but never suspected could be turned against them. I allowed myself a slow, deliberate breath. The jazz quartet in my ear had faded to a low hum, the notes blending with the ambient murmur of the council. My mind drifted to the next motion I had drafted, the one slated for 3 months hence, designed to roll back each seizure one clause at a time. It was a long game, a chess match played across years of paperwork and procedural nuance, but the opening move had been made. The Silthari were busy congratulating themselves on defeating a clumsy human blunder, unaware that the true strike had already landed, hidden in the fine print they very plain sight. The chamber lights dimmed slightly as the council took a brief recess. I rose from my seat, the weight of my concealed datapad pressing against my thigh, and made my way toward the annex where the archives lay. The Silthari sensor's soft click had faded down the corridor, its patrol complete for now. I paused at the doorway, listening to the muted thrum of conversation beyond, and felt a quiet certainty settle over me. By the time they realized what was happening, we'd already won, and the real work was only beginning. I slipped through the heavy oak door of the annex, the soft hiss of the seal giving way to the cool, sterile scent of recycled air and old paper. Rows of towering shelves stretched into the dim glow of recessed lighting, each compartment labeled in the flowing Silthari script that curled like living vines across the metal plates. My datapad throbbed faintly against my thigh, a pulse of encrypted data waiting for the right moment to break free. I moved with the practiced ease of someone who had spent months learning the rhythms of this place. The way the archivist's footsteps echoed on the polished floor, the timing of the environmental cycles that shifted the humidity just enough to make the holographic indexes flicker, the subtle cadence of the Silthari's breathing when they thought no one was watching. I paused at the third aisle where the archive of procedural amendments resided, a section the Council deemed too mundane for regular surveillance. The Silthari believed their own bureaucratic inertia was an impenetrable shield. They never imagined that a human could weaponize that very inertia against them. I lifted the data pad, its surface cool and matte, and tapped a sequence only I knew. A thin filament of light unfurled from the edge, invisible to the naked eye, threading itself into the port of the nearest terminal. The terminal, a relic of the Council's early integration with Silthari tech, flashed a soft amber as it recognized my credentials I had forged months ago, using a combination of stolen access codes and the subtle pressure points I'd learned from observing junior clerks who, in their eagerness to please, often left their authentication tokens carelessly exposed on their desks. The system responded with a quiet chime, and a cascade of windows bloomed across the screen: amendment drafts, voting logs, compliance audits. I navigated to the folder labeled Real Motion Subtle Amendments Confidential, the very document I had slipped into the mid-level admin inboxes at 200 hours. It sat there, innocuous, its headers masked as routine updates to resource allocation quotas. I opened it, and the fine print unfurled like a spider's silk, each clause a tiny hook designed to catch on a specific procedural oversight. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. I began to edit, not to destroy but to reinforce. I inserted a series of conditional triggers that would activate only if a certain threshold of Silthari votes were recorded against a human proposed measure within the next legislative cycle. The triggers were buried deep within the language of the amendment, masquerading as typographical errors that even the most diligent legal parser would overlook as negligible. Yet when the Council's automated audit scripts ran their standard checks, those triggers would seed a subtle alteration in the vote-weighting algorithm, a fractional shift that over time would erode the Silthari's ability to pass motions without unanimous consent. As I worked, the soft murmur of the archive's climate control seemed to sync with my breathing. I felt the weight of every human soul back on Earth, those in the underground labs, the covert cells in the megacities, the diplomats whispering in back rooms of the United Nations, each one counting on this slender thread of code to turn the tide. The Silthari, confident in their superiority, had never considered that their own love for order could be turned into a snare. A sudden scrape of claws on stone made me freeze. I turned my head just enough to catch the silhouette of a Silthari aide slipping into the aisle, its mandibles clicking in a rhythm that betrayed both curiosity and caution. The creature's exoskeleton caught the ambient light, throwing iridescent shards across the shelves. It paused, its multifocal eyes scanning the rows, likely drawn by the faint anomaly in the electromagnetic field my datapad emitted. A field I had deliberately kept low, but not low enough to escape the notice of a being attuned to such subtleties. I forced my muscles to relax, letting my posture slump just enough to look like a weary human archivist leaning against a shelf, datapad cradled against my chest as if reading a dull report. I lowered my gaze, pretending to study the faded ink on a parchment roll, while my mind raced through a dozen contingencies. The aide took a step closer, its translator emitting a soft melodic whine as it parsed the ambient noise for any signs of illicit activity. "Are you lost, human?" the Silthari asked, its voice a resonant timbre that seemed to vibrate through the air itself. The translator rendered the words with a slight delay, giving me a heartbeat to choose my response. I met its gaze, letting a flicker of fatigue and genuine confusion show in my eyes. "Just double-checking the archival indices for the upcoming resource reallocation," I replied, keeping my tone even, the cadence of a clerk who had spent too many nights poring over dry paperwork. "The Silthari standards have been updated recently, and I want to make sure I'm not missing any nuance." The aide's mandibles twitched, a sign of processing. It tilted its head, the translator humming as it cross-referenced my statement with the Council's internal logs. After a moment that felt like an eternity, it emitted a low, approving click. "Your diligence is noted. Remember, compliance is the foundation of our alliance. Any deviation will be addressed." It turned and glided away, its footsteps fading into the low thrum of the archive. I exhaled slowly, the tension in my shoulders easing just enough to allow me to resume work. I finished the edits, sealing the altered amendment with a cryptographic signature that would only be readable by the Council's own verification kernel, a signature that, paradoxically, relied on a Silthari-issued key I had duplicated during a previous maintenance cycle when a technician left his terminal unattended. I closed the terminal, the light dimming as the session ended. I slipped the datapad back into its hidden pocket, feeling the faint thrum of the embedded nanofibers as they prepared to disseminate the packet through the Council's internal mesh at the next scheduled sync, set for 3 months from now, when the Silthari would be preoccupied with their annual summit on orbital resource distribution. I stepped back into the main chamber, the recess still in effect, the low murmur of delegates a comforting blanket of noise. My path led me past the Silthari delegation, their posture still rigid, their confidence unshaken. I allowed myself a brief, almost imperceptible smile as I passed Vraxil, who was engaged in a heated discussion with a rival bloc about trade tariffs. His mandibles clicked in amusement, unaware that the very foundations of his bloc's legislative power were being rewired in the quiet corridors of the archive. The council reconvened with a soft chime, the lights brightening as the delegates took their seats. I settled back into my chair, the weight of my concealed datapad a reassuring presence against my thigh. The jazz quartet in my ear swelled again, a muted saxophone weaving through the ambient hum, its notes a reminder that even in the cold calculus of alien bureaucracy, there was room for improvisation, for the unexpected syncopation of human ingenuity. I felt the familiar tension in my chest, not from fear but from the quiet certainty that the real strike had already landed, buried in the fine print, waiting for the right moment to unfold. The Silthari were busy congratulating themselves on defeating a clumsy human blunder, unaware that the true game had already shifted, that the next move was theirs to make, and that they were about to discover just how deeply a well-placed clause could cut. As the council secretary called the next item to order, I leaned forward, my eyes fixed on the holographic display that flickered with the agenda. The vote would soon begin, and with it, the silent countdown to the moment when the very laws that bound them would begin to unravel, not with a bang but with the soft, inexorable turn of a page. The secretary's voice rose slightly, cutting through the low jazz that still lingered in my earbuds, and the holographic agenda shifted to Item 12, Review of Resource Allocation Protocols for Outer Rim Extraction. A ripple of anticipation passed through the chamber. The Silthari delegates straightened, their carapace plates catching the soft light in a way that made them look almost ceremonial. I felt the familiar prickle at the base of my skull, the signal that my datapad was beginning its silent broadcast, a low-frequency pulse woven into the council's mesh network, timed to coincide with the moment the vote tally would be displayed. The first delegate to speak was a thin-scaled Silthari from the Vraxil block, his voice a resonant click that translated smoothly into the council's lingua franca. He spoke of efficiency gains, of projected yields, of the need to streamline the approval process for new mining licenses. His words were polished, rehearsed, the kind of rhetoric that had kept the Silthari economy humming for centuries. As he spoke, I let my gaze drift to the corner of the display where a small, seemingly innocuous line of text pulsed amber, the embedded clause I had slipped into the amendment, camouflaged as a footnote about contingency audit procedures. When the vote began, each delegate's console lit up with a binary choice, approve or reject. I watched the numbers climb in real time, the green bars swelling for approval. The Silthari were confident, their bloc held a plurality and the opposition was fragmented. Yet beneath the surface, my datapad was doing more than just transmitting a signature. It was injecting a delayed trigger into the council's legislative subroutine, a condition that would activate only if the vote passed with a margin greater than 60%. The condition was simple, yet devastating in its bureaucratic elegance. Any allocation of Outer Rim resources must now be accompanied by a mandatory impact assessment reviewed by an independent human-appointed panel, a panel whose existence had been buried in the annexes of a forgotten trade treaty from the early contact years. The Silthari delegate from Vraxil finished his argument, and the chamber fell into a brief, expectant hush. Then the vote closed. The hologram flickered, displaying the final tally, 63% in favor, 37% against. A low murmur rippled through the delegates, half approval, half disbelief at the sudden surge of support for a measure they had not fully scrutinized. I felt a quiet satisfaction bloom in my chest, the threshold had been met. Almost instantly, the council's internal log began to flash a series of alerts, red flags that the standard protocol parser had never been programmed to recognize. The impact assessment requirement, dormant for decades, was now being auto-generated by the council's own legislative engine, pulling in data streams from environmental monitors, economic forecasters, and crucially, the human-designated oversight committee that I had secretly seated months ago during a routine cultural exchange program. The committee's members were all human analysts embedded within various Silthari research institutes, their credentials flawless, their access unimpeded because they had been granted under the pretense of joint scientific collaboration. As the alerts proliferated, Vraxil's mandibles twitched, not in amusement this time, but in a rapid, agitated click that the translator rendered as "What is this?" He glanced at his console, then at the holographic readout of the newly spawned assessment request, his eyes tracking the scrolling data with a growing frown. Around him, other delegates began to lean forward, their own screens flashing similar notifications. The murmurs turned into a chorus of confused inquiries, the usual decorum of the council fraying at the edges as the realization dawned that a procedural change had been enacted without their explicit consent. I allowed myself a slow, deliberate breath, feeling the weight of the datapad against my thigh shift as it entered a standby mode, its mission accomplished for now. The jazz in my ear softened, the saxophone's notes lingering like a promise. I knew the Silthari would convene an emergency session to challenge the assessment, to argue that the clause was an overreach, that it violated the spirit of their sovereignty. They would bring forth legal scholars, invoke ancient statutes, perhaps even attempt to roll back the vote through a procedural veto. But the beauty of the move lay in its layers. The assessment itself was a conduit, a mechanism that would, over the next weeks, funnel critical data, resource depletion rates, ecological stress markers, socio-economic impacts directly into the hands of my human network. Each report would be a brick in a wall of evidence, each brick positioned to undermine the Silthari's justification for unchecked extraction. And should they try to repeal the clause, they would find themselves ensnared in a paradox of their own making. To nullify the assessment would be to admit that the original vote was based on incomplete information, thereby opening the door to a broader inquiry into the legitimacy of all recent resource allocations, a scrutiny that could stall their entire expansion agenda for years. I settled back into my chair, the chamber's hum now tinged with an undercurrent of tension. The Silthari were still powerful, still confident, but for the first time in decades, their legislative machinery was grinding against a grain of human ingenuity they could not see coming. As the secretary called for a recess, I let the faint smile return, knowing that the real game had just begun, played not with weapons or fleets but with clauses, committees, and the quiet, inexorable turn of a page that would rewrite the balance of power one bureaucratic detail at a time. The gavel's thud still echoed off the vaulted obsidian ceiling when I rose, folding my Kael'thar delegation robes tight around my shoulders to hide the faint outline of the datapad strapped to my thigh. The chamber erupted into the sharp, staccato clatter of Silthari carapaces tapping against their console desks, Vaith's iridescent purple flush bright enough to bleed through the translucency of his ceremonial cowl as he barked orders at his aides, his translator spitting out sharp, clipped demands to freeze all assessment-related data transfers until the emergency session could reconvene. Perfect. His panic was exactly the first domino I'd counted on falling. I kept my head lowered, the hood of my robes pulled low over my eyes, the practiced shuffling gait of a Kael'thar elder, my cover, honed over 3 years of infiltration, carrying me toward the west alcove, the narrow, underused nook lined with public submission terminals reserved for junior delegates to file routine water ration and docking bay requests. The other delegates streamed past me, their conversations a blur of alien dialects and panicked translator output, no one sparing a second glance for the quiet, unassuming representative from the remote Kael'thar protectorate who'd barely spoken a word in the 6 months I'd held this seat. When I reached the alcove, I leaned into the nearest terminal like I was fumbling to pull up a request for extra hydroponic nutrient credits for my delegation's quarters, my free hand sliding under the edge of the terminal's input panel to press the datapad's modified tap against the server coupling hidden there. The haptic buzz against my palm was so faint I almost missed it, the datapad's encrypted siphon already pulling the first wave of assessment data the Silthari's own systems had auto-routed to the Oversight Subcommittee before Vaith's people could lock it down. The files hit the datapad's secure storage in a steady stream, each one marked with a timestamp and the embedded signature of a human operative on the surface. Permafrost melt rates 340% above Silthari public estimates. Coral reef collapse across 12 Pacific extraction rigs documented with unedited drone footage. 2.7 million displaced terrestrial humans logged in the Amazon basin alone. Their villages bulldozed to make way for rare mineral strip mines. Every number was a brick, exactly the kind of evidence the Silthari had spent decades burying in classified annexes and redacted reports. By the time I'd finished pretending to scroll through the nutrient request form for another 10 seconds, the entire first batch was stored, ready to be beamed via the Council's own public comms array to the human legal team waiting in a safe house in what used to be Geneva, disguised as a routine diplomatic update from a minor client species. I was about to straighten up and slip back into the crowd when a soft, polite chime from the terminal made me freeze. A notification popped up on the screen, marked for all minor delegation representatives. The Silthari Extraction Directorate had just issued a temporary ban on all access to the assessment data feed, effective immediately, with any delegate caught attempting to access the files facing immediate expulsion from the council and sanctions against their home world. I almost laughed. They were locking the barn door after the herd had already been stolen. I tapped a single key on the terminal to dismiss the notification, and turned to find a tall, slender Xanthari delegate standing behind me, his iridescent silver markings glowing faintly in the alcove's dim light, a small datapad held loosely in his clawed hand. He was one of the aides I'd been subtly feeding bits of unclassified Silthari overreach data to for the past 2 months, a quiet gambit to peel off neutral delegations before the final vote. Luril, he said, his translator soft, no trace of the usual Xanthari formality. My lead was hoping you might join us for a private huddle before the recess ends. We've been looking at the new assessment clause, and there are a few gaps in the Silthari's argument we think you might have insight into. My mind raced, but my face stayed perfectly blank, the Kael'thar Elder's neutral, unreadable expression holding firm. This was better than I'd hoped. The Xanthari delegation controlled 3 swing votes on the Oversight Committee, the exact votes that would determine whether the assessment was allowed to proceed or gutted in the emergency session. If I could point them toward the data I just pulled, without revealing my source or my identity, I could turn their quiet skepticism into full-throated opposition before Vaith even had a chance to open his arguments. Of course, I said, letting my voice drop into the slow, gravelly tone I'd practiced 100 times for the Kael'thar cover. I have a few thoughts of my own on procedural overreach. Lead the way. As we walked back toward the main chamber, I felt the datapad against my thigh give a single, soft pulse, and the faint jazz in my earpiece picked up, a quick, bright trill of the saxophone I'd programmed as a success signal. Somewhere on the surface below, a team of human analysts were already pulling up the files, already drafting the legal challenges that would tie the Silthari's expansion agenda in knots for the next decade. The Silthari thought they were fighting a procedural challenge, a minor snag in their legislative machinery. They had no idea they were already losing the war, one buried data point, one neutral delegate, one bureaucratic loophole at a time. The chamber doors loomed ahead, the murmur of the waiting delegates spilling out into the corridor, Vaith's voice loud enough to carry as he yelled for the emergency session to be called to order 10 minutes early. I let the faintest smile tug at the corner of my mouth, hidden under the hood of my robes. The game wasn't just begun anymore. We were already halfway to winning. The chamber's air was thick with anticipation, every delegate's posture sharpened as though the outcome of the vote had already begun to etch itself into history. I followed the Xanthari aide to a shadowed corner where 3 delegates stood in a tight semicircle, their silver markings pulsing faintly in rhythm with their breath. They looked at me not as an outsider, but as someone who might hold the key to unraveling the Silthari's carefully woven net. One of them extended a claw, datapad angled toward me. Clause 12, he said, his voice low, the Silthari inserted language that presumes oversight authority without ratification. It's buried beneath procedural jargon, but it effectively grants them unilateral expansion rights. We suspect this violates the Council's founding charter, but we need confirmation. I leaned closer, scanning the highlighted text. The phrasing was subtle, almost elegant in its deception. A single word, presumed, shifted the balance of power from collective oversight to unilateral mandate. It was the kind of linguistic sleight of hand humanity had trained me to spot, the kind of trick we'd spent years preparing to dismantle. I let the silence stretch, then spoke with deliberate weight. The Charter requires explicit ratification for any expansion. Presumption is not ratification. If you challenge this clause under Article 7, the Silthari will be forced to defend an indefensible position. They cannot prove legitimacy where none exists. The delegates exchanged glances, their markings flaring brighter. I could almost feel the tide turning. The Silthari had counted on apathy, on the Council's tendency to rubber-stamp complex language without scrutiny. But scrutiny was exactly what we had engineered. Every loophole, every contradiction, every buried clause had been catalogued by human analysts, waiting for the moment when a neutral bloc would be willing to wield them. The aide's datapad pulsed again, a faint signal that the human team below had already drafted the procedural challenge. I imagined the document, precise, unyielding, a labyrinth of citations and precedents that would choke the Silthari's ambitions before they could breathe. It wasn't a weapon of war, but it was sharper than any blade. Vaith's voice thundered across the chamber, calling for silence as the emergency session began. He stood tall, his robe shimmering with authority, but I saw the faint twitch in his jaw, the subtle tension of someone who sensed the ground shifting beneath him. He believed he was about to dictate terms. He had no idea the terms had already been rewritten. I stepped back into the semicircle of delegates, my Kael'thar mask firmly in place, and let the faintest whisper escape my lips. Strike at the presumption, demand ratification. The Council cannot ignore its own laws. The Xanthari lead inclined his head, his silver markings blazing like a quiet declaration of war. And in that moment, I knew humanity's gamble was working. Not through force, not through fire, but through the quiet, relentless art of turning the enemy's own rules against them. The Zenthari delegate moved with a fluid grace that belied his age, his steps carrying him to the central podium where the council's primary interface shimmered. He placed a slender hand upon it, and the chamber's ambient light dimmed, focusing all attention on the holographic projection that bloomed above him. The Sulthari Charter Clause materialized, its text bleeding red against the blue backdrop, each word a target. "Esteemed Council," he began, his voice a resonant hum that cut through the murmurs, "I invoke Article 7, Section 4, Subsection B. The Charter demands explicit ratification for territorial expansion. The Sulthari document relies on presumption. Presumption is not ratification, it is a void." A ripple of agitation passed through the Sulthari delegation. Their lead, a tall figure named Thessel, rose with deliberate slowness, his carapace gleaming under the harsh light. "The clause has been reviewed by our legal attaches. It is sound. The Zenthari waste our time with semantics." "Semantics are the bedrock of law," I countered, stepping forward before the Zenthari could respond. My voice carried the calm of calculated precision. "And law is the bedrock of this council. If semantics are dismissed, so is the charter. If the charter falls, so does every treaty, every boundary, every protection your species relies upon. Is that a risk you wish to take, Thessel?" The chamber held its breath. Thessel's mandibles twitched, a tell I had catalogued months ago during a closed-door negotiation. He was calculating, weighing the cost of escalation against the danger of retreat. I pressed the advantage. "The Sulthari have submitted this document under the assumption that no one would read it closely. That assumption is false. We have read it, we have analyzed it. And we have prepared a formal challenge, already filed with the Council's arbitration archive." I gestured to the aide, who projected a second document beside the first. "The challenge cites 17 precedents, 23 procedural violations, and a direct contradiction of the Charter's founding principles. The Sulthari may respond, but they cannot refute what is written." Vaith slammed his staff against the floor, the sound echoing like a gunshot. "Enough, this session will proceed with order. The challenge is noted. The Sulthari will have one cycle to respond. Until then, the expansion clause is suspended pending review." Thessel's markings darkened, a sign of suppressed fury. He sat, but his eyes locked onto mine with a predator's focus. He knew, not my species, not yet, but he knew someone had outmaneuvered him, and that someone wore a Kael'thar face. I allowed myself a breath, feeling the faint vibration of the datapad in my pocket, a signal from the human team below. They had done their part, now I had to survive the aftermath. The signal pulsed again, a coded rhythm against my thigh. 2 short pulses, 1 long, phase 1 complete. Extraction window opening in 12 standard hours. I kept my expression neutral, matching the Kael'thar placidity I had spent 3 years perfecting. The Sulthari were already retreating to their private chambers, no doubt scrambling to dissect my challenge. But Thessel lingered, his gaze ablade. "Your thoroughness is noted, Representative Tharl," he said, the name tasting like acid on his tongue. "I wonder if your homeworld's archives are so thorough. I hear Kael'thar Prime has a particular vulnerability in its data migration protocols. A shame if sensitive information were to be misdirected. A threat, a test." The real Kael'thar would bristle with indignation. But I was not Kael'thar. I was a ghost wearing borrowed skin, and my only allegiance was to the blue world hanging in the viewing port. I tilted my head, letting a sliver of condescension seep through. "The Kael'thar have survived for eons by anticipating misdirection, Thessel, but if you wish to test our security, I could arrange a demonstration for the full council, perhaps during the next session on data sovereignty. I hear your telemetry logs from the Cygnus sector are a favorite topic among the auditing committee." His mandibles clicked shut. He turned and walked away, but I caught the subtle gesture he made to an aide, a finger tracing a circle over his chest. A mark, a priority target. I was now a hunted man wearing an alien face, and the only way out was through.